On the last occasion, we talked about a definition of the city that was drawn from the work of Italian fabulist Italo Calvino and his novel Invisible Cities. In today's short discussion, I want to introduce the work of Lewis Mumford, who's a more typical urbanist whose history, the city in history, is considered a classic, and who more directly approaches the question of what is a city. When I met my wife, this is a picture of us on our wedding day. When we met over 30 years ago, our rapport was cemented, as is the case for many youngsters, by the things that we liked to squabble about as much as it was by those things that we shared in common. I loathed U2, she seemed to like them. She drove a car, I didn't, but both of us shared in common a urban identity, and this was the basis for our initial solidarity. I'm from Dublin, she's from New York, so both of us in our separate lives had enjoyed the hustle and bustle of city life, listening to live music, frolicking in parks, enduring the frustration of daily commutes, me on my bicycle, her later on at least in her car. We both have a deep sense of civic pride, even if it's pride for cities that are remarkably different from one another. I think Dublin is the crown jewel of cities. She loves New York City. At the time that we met, I'd rarely left Dublin. I'd made a few short trips to London, but at the time, in the late 1980s, where bearded, scraggly-haired youth were not especially welcome or pretty suspicious, I never felt all that welcome. I was always stopped in the airport, always misdirected, not particularly abused, but not particularly feeling at home over there. And yet at the same time, when I moved to New York, I fell in love with that city. So we had in common a sense of urbanity that distinguished us from the people who lived in rural areas not far from either of those cities. This sense of shared metropolitan identity, the psychological basis of which was identified by George Simmel, the German sociologist, in an essay in 1903 called The Metropolis and Urban Life. He considered it to be intensification of nervous stimulation, which results from the swift and uninterrupted change of outer and inner stimuli. So the psychological basis of urban identity, I'm going to read it again, comes from an intensification of nervous stimulation that you get in cities. I recall, for instance, a rural couple I saw in Dublin in the 1980s that got into a dithering panic as they tried to cross Pearse Street over to Trinity College. They froze in the middle of the traffic, not knowing which way to turn. My love and I jaywalk with equanimity. For my beloved and I, our relationship was catalyzed by shared urban identities. Ours was, so to speak, a urban love. Well, what is this shared identity that binds in common urban dwellers? What is urban life compared with rural life? And what, moreover, is the city? From a reading of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, we've already inferred the following definition of the city. So remember, Calvino doesn't give us this definition. This is one that I drew from a reading of his 55 Invisible Cities. So the definition is an inhabitable constructed locale that may support a dense human population, individuals of which can interact in a way that produces a discernible cultural identity that differs from the cultures of people not inhabiting cities. The shared sense of identity amongst urbanites. So the question for us is, does this account drawn from a fable jibe with definitions that are drawn from the canonical urbanists who've been writing over the last century or so? In particular, we're asking, about the definitions from Lewis Mumford, who we'll turn to in a moment. First of all, I think it is worth asking whether it's useful at all to have a single definition of a city that unites everything from York to Chicago. These have been, of course, our touchstone cities since the beginning. After all, the differences between these cities are profound. An inhabitant of ancient Uruk, if transported to modern Chicago, might be perplexed in knowing what to make of, say, Garrett's popcorn, the river dyed green for St. Patrick's Day, Cubs Stadium, and so forth. Thus, we like to accentuate the differences between habitations in the old world, and or at least in ancient times, and cities in the modern world. But it's hard to know what nomenclature we would use to distinguish them. So instead of creating kind of this enormous, there's a little bit of it of course, but this enormous terminology, urban theorists have preferred to qualify adjectively the city, referring to ancient cities, medieval cities, industrial cities, informational cities more recently, and so on. So for my part, I think it's a useful solution to unify all of these disparate items by the term city, because that practice stresses a continuity of processes that started in ancient times with those that are still going on in the contemporary urban environment. Moreover, as we try to think about the city in ecological terms, it reminds us that the issues that confronted the dwellers of ancient cities 6,000 years ago are still with us today. Sometimes they're alleviated, sometimes they're exacerbated, but the problems are sometimes the same. So over the millennium, for example, there has been this big question to consider: how do large, dense populations living in a constructed environment persist when they are not always directly engaged with the production of the resources needed to sustain them? So sure, you can grow a little food in the city, and maybe we're doing that more and more, something we'll turn to later, but for the most part we do our foraging in cities, in the contemporary world, in the supermarket aisle, and not on the savannah. People in cities live off the fat of the land, and that fat, of course, is cultivated by agricultural labourers out of the city. I discovered the work of Lewis Mumford, who is a historian, urbanist, public intellectual, in the public library in Terranure Village in Dublin when I was still in high school. I'll note in passing that one of the essential civic duties, one of the essential duties of any urban government, is to make available the treasures of civilization to the scrawny youth of cities. The oldest library, of course, the Royal Library of Alexandria, is an urban affair. In fact, the oldest private library, that of Aristotle, was also in a city in Athens. So proximity to public libraries, which is easiest in cities, but it's not a purely urban phenomenon these days, certainly was one of the pivotal circumstances in my life. So anyway, in Terranure Library I found numerous books by Mumford, and I also tracked down several of the articles that he had written over the years, including columns that he'd written for The New Yorker over a period of 30 years on architecture. By the time I arrived in the late 80s in New York City as a graduate student, I thought I knew a thing or two about Mumford, and by extension I thought I knew a thing or two about urban theory. So I mentioned my interest in Mumford to a few of the urban theorists, the kind of budding urban environmental sociology graduate students at the program, and they quickly assured me that nobody reads Mumford anymore. All of that wasted reading in my youth. It so happens, of course, that a couple of decades after that, Mumford is enjoying somewhat of a renaissance. people are really quite enthusiastic about reading him again these days. In fact, when I mentioned him on a Facebook post recently, a lot of colleagues, both young and more senior, mentioned that he had been an important influence on them. So, someone for you to think about. So he's enjoying a renaissance, and of course there's a nostalgic quality to reading him these days. He really feels like he's a writer of from an earlier age. He's a generalist rather than a narrow pedant. He makes swooping claims, often dipping into the psychological literature, the psychoanalytical literature. These days, of course, academic tastes tend to be a little bit more pinched. However, of all of the urban writers, Mumford remains the most tenacious asker of the question, what is a city? And I want to spend a bit of time investigating how he answered that question. And certainly, though he may not have influenced a lot of urban environmental thinkers these days, certainly urban environmental thinkers will find a lot of Mumford's work that resonates with their own thinking, and I believe they can still draw upon this work in a fruitful way. One way to understand the breadth of Louis Mumford's response to the city, to the question of a city's essence, is to look at the index of his most important and influential volumes, The City in History, which was published in 1961. It has a lifetime of erudition packed into a mere, 657 pages or so. And the index is a guide to the multi-dimensional nature of Mumford's understanding of urban form and function. This is the index that he gives to just the question of what a city is. It goes on for at least, the word city itself is sprawled over nearly 2.5 columns. So I think it's kind of interesting maybe to look at this index to ask how he thinks about the city, because one half of the column that he devotes to the city provides a list of the city as, that is, similes to the city, and it's very revealing, so I'm reproducing it here. He describes the city, I'm going to just read through it, as a caste management society, as a center for aggression, as communication center, as container of violence, as cosmos, as hieroglyph for mother, something we'll come back to, as magnet, as meeting place, as organ of civilization, as organ of memory, as prison, as representation of cosmos, as sacred precinct, as school, as simulacrum of heaven, as Stone Age structure, as work of art, and so on. And his list continues after that. So very good. The city is multitudes. It contains multitudes. It's polymorphic. It's polyvalent. But for those who like their definitions to be a little bit more crisp, Mumford also wrote, apologize for the leaving off of the D in Mumford, but he also wrote a essay called What is a City, much earlier, 1937. It's clear, and I'm going to follow this essay just for a little bit, because it's clear from the outset that Mumford is going to kind of deny any definition of a city that thinks of the city as merely a physical fact. Excuse me. He concedes that this approach to the city as physical fact has been subject to numerous investigations. But it's a cautious approach, he says, because those who undertake that approach has, he says, no clear notion of the social functions of the city. So this is giving it away already. Mumford is thinking about the city as both a physical nexus or physical environment, as well as the social functions that it allows. And this is pretty important because some of the most influential urbanists of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois and Jane Jacobs, their foundational thought is that it's culturally disastrous just to think of the city as a physical fact. So the writings of sociologist Du Bois and urbanist Jacobs illustrate the limitations of that approach in trying to rectify urban problems, and both of these figures are ones that we're going to return to in a bit. So a more beneficent approach, a more appropriate approach, is to acknowledge that the city is a social nexus, or social nucleus, and that social nucleus is the essential element in any valid city plan. That's what Mumford says, and what is a city? As a social entity, rather than just a physical entity, the city is a related collection of primary groups and purposive associations. The first, like the family and neighborhood, are common to all communities, while the second are especially characteristic of city life. Combining then the physical and social together is what we would what we would call these days a social ecological system, something that I think Mumford is anticipating here. He writes, the city in its complete sense then is a geographic plexus. Sure, it's a geographical physical location, but it's also an economic organization. It's an institutional process. It's a theater of social action. This term is very important to him, theater of social action, and it's an aesthetic symbol, a kind of beautiful symbol of collective unity. A central concern for Mumford, and this is why he generally delighted in cities, is that cities allow for the unfolding of human social drama. So again, he writes, without the social drama that comes into existence when the focusing and intensification of group activity, through the focusing and intensification of group activity, little hints of simile here from our notes a couple of moments ago, is that there is not a single function performed in the city that could not be performed, has not been performed in open country. So without the social drama that comes into existence to the focusing and intensification of group activity, there's not a single function performed by the city that can't be performed elsewhere. So the essence of the city, what makes the city distinct for human life, is that it allows for a certain type of social drama. And in fact, we might call that social drama the seeds of civilization. Something, it's a big claim, we'll come back to that again as well. So ultimately, the city, since it's a theater of social activity and that the social facts are primary, Mumford recommends that the physical organization of the city, its industries and its markets, its lines of communication and traffic, must be subservient to social needs. So let me break this down again. He's saying, sure, the city is a physical location, its buildings, it's all of those sorts of things, its economic activity, but it's also this kind of social theater in which can bring out the best in us. Excuse me. And ultimately, it's that social function that is primary, and the physical nature of the city is secondary in the definition that he gives. Does this not all seem to be a motivating conception of the city? It's a physical setting in which we live out our best and most interesting lives. So the task of ecology, then, long associated with the flight from the city, should now be committed to understanding how the environment of the city can be configured to allow for the best possible life for humans and the rest of nature upon which we finite creatures depend. Thank you.